Recently, I reviewed the TinHIFI T4 because of its relative popularity, but I ended up not having too many good things to say about it. Sound signature is so-so, technical performance is pretty much non-existent, quality control is shockingly bad, and there are hints of plagiarism here and there that are apparently okay to some of you. That earphone is my first budget Hi-Fi IM, and seeing how bad it was definitely left a sour taste in my mouth and made me question my musical preferences versus the general Hi-Fi crowd. But do you know what the biggest advantage to budget Hi-Fi is? Well, it's that they're cheap, so if you don't like a pair, just buy another one. This time, I'm back with another budget Hi-Fi earphone, which was kindly gifted to me by Keephifi, so let's see if this $30 metal-clad earphone is able to claw back some points for Team Hi-Fi. This is Earphoneus Fanaticus, and in this video, I'll present to you my detailed review of the BLON BL-01. At the time of writing this script, I don't know how long the review is gonna be, but you have the ability to look at the length of the video and be absolutely intimidated by the long journey of earphone review you're about to embark on. And that's why timestamps are available in the video description so that you can skip ahead to whatever aspects of the earphone that interest you the most. Before I start this review, I want to once again give a big shout out to Vivian from Keephifi for gifting me this earphone. I really don't get that many views, and yet she still invited me to do a review because she just wants to know what I think of this earphone. It's been a few months since I received this pair, so I hope the feedbacks I'm about to give are worthwhile to BLON, Keephifi, as well as you guys who've been sticking around despite my infrequent uploads. That being said, this earphone is not going to get any preferential treatment just because I didn't pay for it. I love nitpicking earphones no matter how cheap or expensive they are because I treat every review opportunity as a learning experience. The more I analyze, the more I know what to look for in the future. So if there is anything I don't like about this earphone, please rest assured that I will let you know all about it. Normally, I would start the review by looking at physical design of the earphone, but since BLON and Keephifi are looking for suggestions, I actually want to start with the packaging first. The earphone comes in this boring looking box that actually feels quite sturdy. While I don't exactly mind the design of the box, I do have a few things to nitpick on the back. Like I briefly mentioned in my unboxing, the font sizes and capitalization are very much all over the place. Technical parameters too small while model number looks about right to me. Capitalization for kilohertz aren't the same between the Chinese and English versions, dB shouldn't be all caps, same thing for impedance, conductor and wearing mode. Speaking of impedance, why is the ohm superscripted? And why is ohm spelled out for the English caption? And why is D in diaphragm capitalized but not biofiber? Just keep it uniform, guys. It would have definitely looked much cleaner and less, well, Hi-Fi-esque. In terms of physical design, the BLON BL-01 uses a single 10mm dynamic driver. This driver is special in that it is actually made of biofiber or cellulose, a plant material that you might know from secondary school biology. BLON is technically not the first one to use such material. The old yet venerable VSonic GR07 uses it, and the KB Ear Lark, which is around the same price as this earphone, also uses it along with an extra BA. I was wondering if BLON actually just sourced the driver from some manufacturer, so I asked Vivian at Keephifi, and turns out the driver is actually customized by BLON. Now, customized can mean a few things. A, they made the driver entirely in-house. B, they customized it by tuning the frequency response but are not involved in physically making it. Or C, they worked with a manufacturer to make an entirely new driver. In any case, I've actually never had any experience with such technology, so I was very curious about how it performs. The housing is made mostly of polished zinc alloy or Kirksite. The colorway I got is light color, but it also comes in white steel. So white is not a light color? I wonder what the other colorway is like. Oh, here's an image from AliExpress, and this is the one I got. Yeah, so there's always this thing about buying Hi-Fi, which is that you never know what you are gonna get exactly, because they tend to use computer rendered images rather than real photos of their products, and they always look flat and matted. Quite ugly, really. Now, you might look at this one instead and say, oh, it's got reflections, it must be a real photo. Nope. How unmistakably Hi-Fi. In any case, I tried looking up more photos, and I just can't for the hell of me tell the difference between the two colorways. I wished my supposedly dark color BL-01 was even darker. Let's get back to the review. On hands, it feels polished and very sturdy. Construction-wise, it's made of a big exterior piece and a small interior piece with a vent port and built-in nozzle, which is obviously better looking and more well-made than your typical TinHIFI nozzle, which is just a cylinder jammed into the housing. It is designed after the usual IM form factor, but the bean-shaped housing actually gets kinda pointy at the bottom. I like how it looks, but at first I thought this might be a cause of concern for comfort, but in reality, this is a non-issue. In fact, I think the earphone is quite comfortable to wear, though I do recommend switching out the stock tips because they don't provide the best seal. Now, even though the housing is made of two metal pieces, they're actually very well aligned without sharp edges. The gap between the two pieces is huge, but it should be easy to clean as a result too. Between this and the TinHIFI T4, which is about 4 to 5 times more expensive, there's really just no contest in terms of look and finish. The T4 looks downright cheap, while the BL-01 looks like it might actually be worth something. Now, this is about time for me to borrow this one line that we've all heard so many times from TinHIFI reviews, that it punches beyond its price point. I've heard this so many times that it starts to feel cliché and dishonest, but this time, I think this description is well deserved. Or maybe the T4 is just way overpriced, I don't know. That being said, there's one thing I want to nitpick about the housing, and it is these yellow text on the exterior side. Who thought this is a good idea? Just put blonde there, and don't even do WGZBLON, that's too many letters. The BL-01 uses a protruding 2-pin socket for connecting to cable, and while you can use third-party 2-pin cables with it, you can't actually use this stock cable with earphones without the same protruding socket. The ear-guide is the heat-molded type. While the general evenness and vertical alignment are basically perfect, this channel usually gets stuck on either side of the earpiece while the other channel has no such problem. The cable overall is very lightweight, flexible and has no bounce. It'll make some noises when it rubs against clothes, but I wouldn't say it's any worse than your typical cables. There's no choker on the cable, so some might find it a bit messier to untangle after putting it in your pocket. I can't find any information regarding the metal used for conduction, so I'm just gonna assume it's oxygen-free copper. BLON says the cable is 1.2 meters long, but mine measures at around 1.35 meters or 53 inches, which I find to be too long for reaching down the pocket where my DAB sits. They could have honestly taken off like 15 centimeters and it would still be too long, not to mention longer cables are generally considered to be worse according to physics because of higher resistance, but I wouldn't worry too much about that specific downfall if I were you. It terminates with a right angle jack, which I do prefer over straight angle jack. Overall, the cable is just a no-frill regular cable that works well. Oh, and it doesn't shock me when plugged into a charging source unlike the TinHIFI T4. Now that we have a better understanding of the earphone, let's talk about this little manual inside the box. Now when I say little, I'm not just referring to the size of the manual, I'm also talking about the font size when you actually try to read the bloody thing. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you out there actually need magnifying glasses for this. At the time of unboxing, I didn't realize they have all this in English on the back, so let's check it out. There's this bit about brand story and inheritance, which actually has nothing to do with inheritance. They do mention repeatedly that their products are designed with Chinese traditions and art culture in mind, but up until this point, I'm just not seeing the influence. There are no Chinese words or art patterns on the housing, the materials used aren't particularly Chinese even though that's exactly what they said they were trying to do, and the packaging itself doesn't really scream Chinese to me either. I mean, I guess the name is Chinese and it does sound quite beautiful even in English, but the cultural influence only gets this far. Maybe they started out wanting to do stuff like that with their products, but they kind of gave up at certain points and never bothered to change all this? Speaking of not bothering to change simple things, there's this page on how to wear the earphone, but the earphone looks nothing like what I got, and it certainly doesn't use metal wired ear guide. And then there's this on how you're supposed to cinch up the choker behind your neck. Where's the choker? The earphones are not like vases. Someone should put this on a t-shirt. If you want to achieve something, You must know your own shortcomings first, and then fight for it. And that's my dose of inspiration for today. Thank you, Shifu. I honestly have way too much fun reading the English version, especially when the Chinese version actually makes so much more sense. Like this one on how the Chinese have adapted with both the pen and the sword, and then somehow they link that to how the beautiful shape of an unspecified object needs to coexist with excellent sound quality. They're actually trying to say that an earphone should in a sense be adapted for all genres of music, hence the spiel about pen and sword. Now I think we can all agree that BLON could use some serious editing to iron out the sentences, and I get it, BLON is a Chinese brand and traditionally, these brands haven't been good with writing English descriptions for international markets. Now, BLON might feel a bit embarrassed by their grammatically correct yet somewhat strange English, but I do believe that the soldier will be brave after feeling ashamed. So keep it up, brother. Let's touch on technical specs. Frequency response is rated at 20 to 20 kHz, which is quite typical for IEM, I think. Impedance is rated at 16 ohms, which seems to be a fairly common number these days considering that I've reviewed 3 other earphones that also has the same impedance. Because the BL-01 uses dynamic driver, you shouldn't have to worry too much about the 1/8 rule, though as always, ideally you would want the LP impedance as low as possible. As for sensitivity, I looked at the specs on the packaging and got 102 dB, but I didn't know if that's dB per milliwatt or dB per volt. Linso says it should be dB per milliwatt, so let's roll with it. Relative to other IEMs in my chart, 102 is actually very low, ranking the BL-01 at the 3rd lowest position in my collection. Sensitive earphones are easier to drive but are also more likely to reveal source hisses, so you can't win it all in this regard. That being said, even by UERR, which is rated at 100 dB per milliwatt but with double the impedance, is still super easy to drive even with my smartphone, and I certainly didn't find the BL-01 hard to drive either. Let's check out the accessories. It comes with 1 pair of generic silicone tips and 2 pairs of fake SpinFit tips. Yup, fake SpinFit strikes again. If I flip the upper flange up, you can see the same swiveling mechanism as SpinFit. TinHIFI brands just can't get enough of that juicy plagiarism. I say that because when I checked out the TinHIFI T4, I found these tips which clearly got their colors from the SpinFit CP100, except those don't also plagiarize the swivel mechanism. In any case, I think this is absolutely unacceptable, and while they might be able to get away with shit like this in China, when your goal is to make TinHIFI competent on a global level, you can't be doing this. What BLON and other TinHIFI brands should do instead is to just partner with SpinFit. Collaborations are cool and will certainly bring more legitimacy to your brand, especially when SpinFit is a much more well-known name in the earphone community. If you don't want people looking down on Chinese products, then stop giving them reasons to. Besides the fake SpinFit tips, the earphone also comes with this little cloth pouch. The cost cutting is obvious here, seeing that the BLON logo is just stamped on, rather than actually being printed on or stitched on. It provides zero protection against stress whatsoever, and it feels a little rough to the touch, so it might even leave scratch marks on the beautiful casing of the BL-01. I suppose you could argue that the pouch can keep dust away, and thus provide some form of protection. I'm really stretching it, guys. In any case, this is better than nothing, and for the price of the whole package, I would say this is already good enough. The ear tips and the pouch are the only 2 accessories that came with the BL-01, and normally I will at least complain a little about it, but seeing that the whole package is actually so cheap, I don't think a complaint like that is justified. So far, even though I have roasted BLON for pretty much everything that's not the earphone, the earphones are not like vases. The earphone itself is truly impressive, at least in terms of physical design. I think the bean shape is quite cute, I like the polished casing as well as how well put together the whole thing is. If the TinHIFI T4 gets to be priced at around $80, I see no reason why this pair shouldn't be priced much higher for its craftsmanship. I really feel that this pair will outlast 2 to 3 pairs of those T4s. And if it also performs well in subjective testing, I think this earphone would be a very easy recommendation for anyone on a budget. So let us get into sound analysis now. In the following section, I will talk about different aspects of sound performance of this earphone. My auditioning setup consists of the Onkyo DP-X1A as the source, lock range adjust at +2, and digital filter set to sharp. Besides local files, I also use an app called USB Audio Player to play back Tidal music, as well as my PC Quad Mojo setup for tests like bass rattling and perceived dynamic range. As for the earphone, I'll be testing it with the non-fake SpinFit tips for the best seal and comfort, and I'll also be pairing it with my recently purchased Effect Audio Aries 2 Plus cable in order to take advantage of the balanced output on my DPX1A, which gives lower distortion. I'll also be doing this for all future reviews in hopes that I can provide more accurate analysis of the sound quality. Now, even though I'm not using the stock cable, you shouldn't have to worry about there being significant differences in sound signature or sound quality. Sure, the Aries 2 Plus is all copper and very thick, but the only difference will come from me using balanced output, not from inherent sound changing characteristics of the cable. So, here we go. Let's start with bass response. Despite being rated to go only as low as 20Hz, I can actually start hearing the bass from 15Hz even though it's very faint. From there, the volume gradually increases, and when it reaches 70Hz, it starts to feel loud. That's not to say that there's nothing before 70Hz, but rather there's just less presence. From there, it keeps getting louder towards 150Hz, after which the volume seems to drop gradually towards 200Hz. Interestingly, when I turn up the volume, from 30 to 90Hz, the bass doesn't actually sound as clean as, say, the Sony MDR EX1000 when volume matched by ear. It's almost like there's some sort of fluttering sound that's noticeable enough to distract me from the tone. The bass might be tuned a bit too high over the driver's capability. The JVC FW1800, which is one of the bassiest earphone in my collection, only shows similar unclearness below 40Hz. This might be what audiophile refers to as distortion, but I can't say for certain. But looking past that, bass volume of the BL-01 is no doubt significantly stronger than the Ultimate Ears Reference Remastered, which has a ruler flat bass response, and the tuning definitely makes music more exciting. It is strong and dynamic, but not the fastest. Besides, I think the bass can be overpowering or distracting at times. For example, when listening to Poco Allegretto by Brahms, when the pizzicato of double bass and cello come in, they just keep going bong bong bong, which sounded way too boomy considering the fact that they are really just accompaniment to the main theme by the violins. They are marked with piano for crying out loud. There are many other cases where I find the bass to be unnecessarily loud, but it would take me too much time if I do point out every single one of those instances. It's not just a matter of bass being distracting. I think that it also fills up too much of the headspace, and combined with the mids tuning, which I'll talk about later, really makes music a little suffocating at times. Personally, I would want the mid bass to be 2 to 3 dBs lower just so it's balanced better for matching with more music and mastering. Sub bass on the other hand doesn't feel emphasized unnaturally and is certainly quite audible with good decay. Overall, despite the problems I discovered, I think most people would be very satisfied with the bass quality, especially considering the price. Though personally, being so accustomed to UERR sound, I would absolutely like the mid bass to be weaker, and this might also lead to some improvements in terms of distortion or the fluttering sounds I heard. Next, let's talk about mid response. Starting with lower mids, despite the strong bass response, cello doesn't sound as rich as expected, and in a sense, the Biocellulose driver performs like a bassy balanced armature driver. It might be because there's not much boost after 200Hz. Still, I think cello presentation is very dynamic sounding with excellent detail in vibrato that rivals the UERR. Vocal vibrato is fantastic too, and again I will rank it on the same level as the UERR, except the latter does it without relying on the slight upper mids boost from 2 to 5 kHz. The BL-01 also sounds cleaner compared to the UERR, but upon EQing, I found that it's just because the BL-01 is tuned to slightly attenuate the mids in order to maybe prevent room reflections during recording from showing up. And while it does sound subjectively good with this attenuation, to me, this feels like it's tampering with how the recording is supposed to be originally. If you like your IEMs more atmospheric or airy sounding, you might not enjoy this attenuation either. However, this might also be the reason why the BL-01 manages to not sound messy, even with busy music with multiple instruments going on at the same time. Though relatively speaking, vocals might need more air in order to attain better balance against the strong bass response. The average width of the soundstage doesn't help in this regard either, but other than that, I didn't find any major issues with vocal presence. Overall, I find the mid response to be very pleasing indeed, and if you are not looking to use this for monitoring sounds, you will absolutely enjoy the BL-01 for its clean mid presentation. Let's move on to treble response. When listening to frequency sweeps, the BL-01 begins to be confidently audible at around 15.5 kHz, but unfortunately, my copy does suffer from severe channel imbalance from 15 to 14K. I can literally hear the sound switching from right to left. I've never experienced this with other IEMs before, so BLON really needs to work on this. Though admittedly, this range is very high-pitched, and it's unlikely you'll run into music that intentionally adds 15K or 14K sine waves. Nobody likes mosquito sounds in their music after all. Anyway, at 14K, there's a peak that drops gently towards 13K, and then there's another sharp peak at 12K, but it drops fast after 11K. Finally, there's a very typical 9 to 8K rise. But what does this all mean? For some reason, at times I find percussions to be rather distracting comparing to the UERR, so I have to turn down the volume, which also reduces perceivable dynamics in the mids. You do need a lot of dBs to fully enjoy that 16 or 14 bits of dynamic range in your files after all. In comparison, I can turn the volume way up with the UERR without having to worry about the treble murdering my ears, ever. It's a shame really, seeing that the BL-01 has such dynamic sounding mids that would surely benefit even more from a higher volume. Even as a treble head, I also have to report that unfortunately, this earphone is somewhat prone to sibilance, which can be explained by the combination of upper mids and treble boost, and I'm inclined to blame it on the upper mids. Granted, it's not like every single s or sh are going to clip through like white noises from an old TV, but I do have files that have their own intentional elevations in the high ranges, and the BL-01 can certainly sound too hot in those instances. However, if I listen to metal, because tonal balance against the mids is less important, what I end up perceiving is very clean percussions with fast yet appropriate amounts of decay that also have enough dynamics to form a contour rather than sounding smeared unlike the TinHIFI T4. However, there's one issue where I feel that some cymbals sound a little bit lower pitched than they should be, which is quite a strange experience. They still sound clean, but they just don't sound right. All in all, I'm very torn about the treble response. On one hand, the BL-01 does really well when only percussions are concerned, like in the case of metal, but on the other hand, if your primary preference is normie band sounds, you can sometimes hear how hot the treble gets, and combined with a strong bass and comparatively weak mids, it creates a dilemma where you want to turn up the volume to hear more of the vocals and melodic line, but then the other ranges are sort of preventing you from doing so. I wished the overall signature is less V-shaped. Let's move on to soundstage and imaging. Beginning with horizontal soundstage, I feel that it is noticeably narrower than the JVC FW1800, which is currently my benchmark for soundstage width. This can be quite problematic considering the sound signature. As I explained before, because of the V-shaped signature, the bass can fill up a lot of the headspace, and the recessed mids also takes away the atmospheric feel that's so important for classical music. Directions and layering are both good, so I can tell where sounds are coming from with relative ease. However, imaging is quite weak, meaning musical elements are imaged as faint silhouettes without outline. I also think that texturing can be improved, because with practically all string instruments, I can't always hear the bowing texture despite the otherwise good dynamics reproduced by the earphone. UERR is my benchmark for this, and with it, I can just hear that much more of the upward and downward strokes of the bow. Finally, since there's only one driver, there's no vertical layering to speak of, but at least the height of the soundstage is quite tall. All in all, there are certainly a lot of things that I would like to see improved as a critical listener who frequently dabbles with earphones much more expensive than the BL-01. But in this case, one thing that BLON can do which shouldn't be too expensive for consumers would be to physically place the driver farther away from the nozzle, either by making the housing thicker or replacing the straight firing nozzle with an inclined nozzle. Let's also briefly touch on dynamic range. Larger dynamic range means that you can hear both the really loud sounds in the recording, but also the subtle details when everything quiets down. This time, I'm able to achieve 48 dBs for audible vocals or 66 dBs at which I can only hear the sibilants. I should point out that in order to perform well in this test, the full scale volume that I can tolerate must be very high because dynamic range in a sense scales with volume. That's why louder is better to our ears. Anyway, this is not a scientific test, and the actual dynamic range is also influenced by how good the earphone seals up your ears and the noise floor in surroundings. So when you're out and about, a lot of the dynamic range will be covered up by that noise floor, at which you will have to turn up the volume in order to get those dBs back, but you also risk hearing damage. That's all for sound analysis. Next, I'll be recommending some ear tips for the BL-01. These are all the ear tips I have in the collection, and thanks to its 5mm nozzle diameter, there are indeed a lot of ear tips to choose from. But since I haven't talked about the fake SpinFit that this earphone comes with, let's cover those real quick. I don't have much to say for these really, because I can't get a good see with them, and from this shot you can tell why that would be the case. There are only two sizes of the fake SpinFit tips that the BL-01 comes with, and what I'm showing you here is already the bigger one. It also doesn't help that the earphone has such a short nozzle, but the non-fake SpinFit solves the problem because of its big and rounded shape. Unlike my usual reviews, this time I only have one tip that I want to recommend, and that is the Spiral Dot Plus. The one thing that I have the most trouble with is the bass, so I went for the one tip that I knew could alleviate this problem, and I was immediately rewarded the results I was looking for. Well, partially what I was looking for. I would say that this tip makes the bass more palatable in general because it makes the bass less boomy and prominent, especially if you go for a shallow fit, though the mid bass is still a little more than what I like. It still creeps in the most inopportune time, and remember what I said about the pizzicato in Poco Allegretto? Yup, they're still going bong bong bong, but at least this time they're somewhat softened up and not as punchy. An added benefit to the weakened mid bass is that there's actually now a better tonal balance, so I can actually turn up the volume and hear more details in the mids. The melody, the vocals, the accompaniment, anything that falls into the mid-range benefits, which is basically most of the music really. I also think that cymbals no longer sound lower pitched, though admittedly it wasn't a huge problem before. Because of the large opening of this ear tip, you get an even taller soundstage that helps to get back some air to the mid-range, but imaging suffers as a result. To me, this is an acceptable trade-off because you are more likely to be bothered by bad sound signature rather than bad imaging for casual listen. How many of us actually sit down and do critical listening all day every day anyway? At least I've got better things to do. Unfortunately, there's still one thing that would bother you during casual listens, and that is sibilance. The S and SH sounds still peak too much, and since most ear tips can't attenuate the upper mids to treble range, BLON needs to take charge and experiment with filter design or how the driver is tuned. Comparing to the stock tips, when paired with the Spiral Dot Plus, the earphone does sound lighter, so you do have to turn up the volume a little bit. I also think that the material used in the Spiral Dot Plus is softer, so it is more comfortable for long wear. As for the other tips, I feel that they can't help tame the bass, or they might even make it louder like most SpinFit tips. I also thought that the Comply tips would be a good match because they tend to cut down upper mids and treble, but they're straight up too loose for the 5mm nozzle. So yeah, Spiral Dot Plus is my only recommendation this time. Let's draw an end to this exceedingly long review. In short, I'm actually very impressed by what BLON is able to achieve with the BL-01, especially considering the price. For a fraction of the price of the TinHIFI T4, you get something that's denser, more polished, more solid, and subjectively better sounding. And the only thing that the T4 wins in is that it comes with a much nicer leather case, while the BLON only comes with a disappointing cloth bag. And so, to answer the question I raised at the start, I do think that in a broad sense, this earphone has somewhat vindicated what I felt about budget Hi-Fi because of its drastically better build quality and sound signature. Sure, the sound signature is still quite far off what I prefer, like for instance, I really wished the mid-bass and upper mids were weaker, or the mids were more prominent, but these should be easy fixes for BLON in the future. To illustrate my point, let me borrow this graph from Clinical. If the frequency response is squashed like this, then I'll be happy already. Just make the peaks less drastic. Heck, you could probably dial this with EQ on your own and enjoy these $30 gems. But you can't take the EQ everywhere, so my solution is swapping to the spiral dot plus tips and wear the earphone shallow. This doesn't fix the occasional sibilance, but at least it does fix the thunderous bass. Speaking of ear tips, I need to grill BLON once again for going with the fake SpinFit. This is very disappointing and doesn't help the bad impression against TinHIFI that they are just cheap plagiaristic copycats. To better legitimize the brand, BLON should straight up include SpinFit or even work with them to design new tips if they like the swiveling mechanism so much. Besides the important stuff, I also spent a lot of time on the manual and packaging. They look characteristically TinHIFI, and that is to say that they look disorganized and not well thought out for English audience. I'm at least happy to see English available at all in the first place on the manual, but what's turn, combination, start and inheritance? I speak Chinese, and when I flip to the Chinese version, everything just makes much more sense. They're actually referring to the structure of classical Chinese writing. If I didn't know the language, how would I be able to make any sense of this? And they kept going on and on about Chinese inspirations in their earphones, and I just can't even find a whiff of it on the BL-01. And more embarrassingly, the wearing instructions don't even match the BL-01. Again, the e-guide is not metal wired, and there's no choker, but here we are. Now, coming back to general consumers like you, how much do you really need to care about all this? Frankly, not even a single bit. But I am an earphone reviewer, and I was asked to give opinions on the earphone, and that means digging into every little nooks and crannies in order to identify things for the manufacturer to improve. So even though you might not care about the weird capitalizations or the somewhat baffling translations, I care because I bear the good intention of wanting small brands to succeed. If they want to become bigger players in the field, they have to mature in so many ways. Having proper English to go along with their products will be a good start, and they can leave all the tuning stuff for the engineers to worry about. When there's good marketing material, the good sound quality will do the rest. As for the rest of you, I think you should go ahead and buy the BL-01. I think it really epitomizes what budget TinHIFI can do, and if the TinHIFIs are enough to satisfy you, I can't even imagine the degree of ecstasy you will feel when you get your hands on these. I'm genuinely impressed by what BLON has achieved here, and I think they have a lot of potential to grow bigger. But otherwise, this is going to be it for this review. If you found it useful, don't forget to like and share the video. And if you have any question, please let me know in the comment section. If you have this earphone, I would also love to know what you think of it. Anyway, I'll come back with yet another earphone review. Hopefully I will see you again in the next video. Goodbye, friends.